So I'm going to start off today by breaking one of my cardinal rules of preaching, and I'm going to tell you a story about going to the gym. So with moving here to Chapel Hill, one of the new leaves that I'm kind of turning over has to do with physical fitness. And so back in July, I joined the local CrossFit gym. Now CrossFit workouts, if you're not familiar with them, they're extremely intense and challenging and incorporate lots of weights. And the whole thing is really rather intimidating for me. So anyways, when I go to the gym, I've taken to doing something just a little bit subversive, which is that I always wear the same t-shirt, or rather, I wear different shirts, but the different shirts all have the same design on them. I've got several different shirts with the same design. It's not like I've thrown personal hygiene out the window. But these shirts, each of them with the same design, were a gift from a parishioner of mine. I did his wedding. I did the dedication ceremonies for both of his children. And he was an artist and just a truly amazingly gentle and beautiful soul. And the shirts that he gave me each have a stylized Doberman pinscher on them, standing perfectly still while a butterfly sits on the nose of the Doberman pinscher. And the shirt reads, "Compassion is strength." Now, Muncie in the office, she managed to find this image and put it on the front of your order of service, so you can actually see what it is that I wear on my T-shirt to the gym. Oh, yeah. Compassion is strength, and I wear it to the gym to be subversive and to remind myself that strength isn't defined only by pull-ups and push-ups and clean and jerks. And I wear these shirts to remind myself to be compassionate with myself when I run up against my own limitations, when there's things that are challenging to me and way, way beyond my physical capacity. Compassion is strength. That's a subversive message not only at the gym, but it's a message that seemingly goes against the grain of our larger culture in which we find ourselves. One doesn't need to go very far in our society to find examples of a profound lack of compassion, of a compassion deficit, and a compassion deficiency. I remember reading a story last month about how shortly after the death of comedian Robin Williams, within hours of the news breaking, his daughter, 25 years old, received a number of vulgar, cruel, and abusive messages on social media. So many, in fact, that she decided to cancel her social media accounts. And that was like, reading that, my heart kind of broke a little bit, and I thought, who is it that does that? Recently, numerous online news and opinion sites have significantly modified, restricted, or even eliminated their comment sections outright because of the basic lack of human decency displayed by some of those who participate. In fact, I go on CNN.com and I sometimes play a little game with myself, which is I read the headline and then I try to guess whether or not the comments will be open or not in that. And I don't read them. I don't expose myself to that trash, but I try to guess whether or not they'll even allowed comments on that story. A story about one particular instance of online bullying contains this line: "The episode proves that some people will be horrible no matter what the situation." But the compassion deficit doesn't only exist in cyberspace. If only being face-to-face rather than communicating anonymously through screens made us more compassionate. But I remember hearing about how in July in Murrieta, California, hundreds of anti-immigrant protesters met Department of Homeland Security buses transporting undocumented children from Central America. The protesters chanted at the children, "Go home and we don't want you," and blocked the buses from entering the town. That's just one example, and I'm positive that if we were to all put our heads together, we could come up with many, many more examples of profound failures of compassion from news stories and from other world events and from stories in our own lives. These examples that I've cited from the past handful of weeks alone are particularly nasty. And the bad news is that there's many more examples we could come up with. But the good news may be that incidents like the ones I've mentioned involve only dozens of people, and that while it may be true that some people will be horrible no matter what the situation, the vast majority of us are probably not horrible on any given day. And that's something to celebrate. Simply put, I don't look out in this room and I don't worry that anyone in this room goes trolling anonymously around the internet looking for vulnerable people to antagonize. I'm in the right place, right? Okay, good. I'm working off the assumption here that in talking to you, I'm talking to people who are, in your lives, basically compassionate. Try to take care of each other and do things to try to alleviate some portion of suffering in the world. So please don't think that I'm standing up here talking about compassion because I assume that you are deficient or in need of remedial instruction. Rather, I'm assuming that we're drawn to living compassionate lives and want to hear a good word of encouragement about the practice of compassion in these days. What do I mean by a compassion deficit? In his famous I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King used this image that I find amazing. He said, "We refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity in this nation." And so when I talk about a compassion deficit, I'm talking about this same sort of idea. Ideally, that there would be enough compassion in the society to hold and to embrace each person who grieves, to bless each unblessed child, to lessen the amount of suffering in our society. But much of the suffering and anguish that is allowed to occur happens because of a lack of compassion, a compassion shortage, a compassion deficit. One basic part of being a religious organization is being active in generating more compassion in the world, and doing our part to shrink the compassion deficit. So I want to say a few words about compassion in general, and I'm going to draw a lot of what I have to say about compassion from the work of Karen Armstrong, especially her book, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. Armstrong was a Catholic nun who left her orders and became a world-renowned thinker on religion in the modern world. She's written dozens of books. Many of them compare the three Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. She's written multiple books on the origins of Islam and about the idea of God in the modern world. In her last book, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life, she adopts a 12-step recovery structure, charting out a pathway that begins with learning about compassion and ends, the 12th step, with having the capacity to love and feel compassion even for our enemies. The word compassion, Armstrong tells us, is rooted in the word passion. The way we use the word passion today indicates kind of an intensity of feeling and ardor and enthusiasm. But the word passion in its classic sense means suffering, the depth of the experience of suffering. The word passion is connected to the events surrounding the execution of Jesus, which is known as the Passion. And the prefix "com" indicates withness. So compassion means suffering with. Karen Armstrong remarks that often the word is regarded as fluffy and sentimental, or is just completely misunderstood. As she traveled the world speaking about compassion, she realized when she was talking with reporters in Denmark or Russia or Korea who would then translate her interviews, that they would translate compassion, some of them would translate compassion as pity. And she wants to say that those two things are in fact very different things. Compassion has to do with connection, with actually being present to the person who is suffering. Whereas pity maintains an air of separation and distance. It looks down upon. It objectifies the one who is suffering. Pity doesn't alleviate suffering. So for Armstrong, the first of the 12 steps has to do with learning about compassion, and the second step has to do with looking at the world, whether that's your family or your community or your city or your planet, and seeing both those places where compassion is evident as well as those places where compassion is absent or lacking. But Karen Armstrong's third step is where things start to get a bit tricky. This third step has to do with being compassionate with yourself. As she points out, the biblical injunction to love your neighbor as yourself only really works if you actually love yourself. So if I were to ask, how many of us think of ourselves as compassionate people, I think a lot of us would raise our hands. But if I were to change the question and ask, how many of us are good at feeling compassion for ourselves, I think we might get a different show of hands a little bit. At least that's my guess. Compassion for oneself means having the ability to face into your own suffering, your own struggling, to be present with oneself in the midst of trial rather than trying to run away from who you are. It means cultivating an attitude of welcoming kindness to oneself in spite of failings and shortcomings. It means loving yourself. I mentioned at the beginning of the sermon the new habit I've developed since moving here to North Carolina of becoming better at getting exercise, and the self-compassion and humility that this new discipline has required of me. But one thing I want to tell you is that as you get to know me, you may discover that I do have somewhat of a tendency to be my own harshest critic. And so when I was packing up to move out here, I was mentally fascinated, mentally fantasizing about all the many new leaves I might turn over, with which going to the gym was only one very, very small one. I would improve physical fitness, yes, and read more and write more and spend more time socializing and more time with family. I would give more intentional attention to this and this and this area of ministry without suffering any drop whatsoever in those other areas of ministry. My wife at the first service was nodding her head. Yeah, she has to live with me. And that's why self-compassion is so very important. How will we ever learn to love and feel compassion for our enemies if we don't first stop treating ourselves as an enemy? And I need to remind us that compassion for yourself is only the third of Karen Armstrong's 12 steps. There's 9 steps after it. Lord, have mercy on us. And so what I want to do this morning is I want to leave you with a bit of a meditation about compassion and about compassion as strength. I want you to imagine that you are out driving in a car when out of nowhere someone comes driving too fast and cuts you off. As human beings, we're storytellers. And so what is the story that we create about the person who has cut us off? A friend of mine is a professor of psychology, and one of his research interests is something that he calls charitable attributions, which is a word that's a little bit complicated. But what it means is that when we attribute motive to others, we can either be charitable or uncharitable. We can either be compassionate or lack compassion in the motives that we give to that person. So we might tell ourselves a story. We might say, perhaps the driver of that other car just got a call from the hospital that his wife is in labor. That's a charitable story to tell. Or perhaps that other driver is just a self-centered, entitled jerk with no regard for anyone else. That would be an uncharitable attribution. But when we're in kind of the confines of our own car, that story that we tell about that other person may not matter all that much. But my friend, the professor, says that when a student of his doesn't show up for class, he's tempted, since we're storytellers, he's tempted to come up with some sort of story to explain why. And then the story does matter because it has all sorts of ramifications and implications. Is the student flaky and not all that serious or disciplined and perhaps doesn't belong in the class? Or did the student have an awful case of food poisoning that kept her in bed despite her Herculean efforts to make it to the lecture? All of a sudden, the stories that we tell begin to matter a lot. And it's never just any car that cuts us off. The type of car that cuts us off may influence the story we decide to tell. If it's a $100,000 Lexus or a Hummer that cuts us off, we might tell a particular story about that person. And the story we tell about the Hummer is probably not that the person driving it was in a traumatic accident and needs to feel safe in a larger car in order to feel safe. That's not the story that we tell, right? But if it's a Prius with a no fracking bumper sticker on it that cuts us off, maybe we'd be charitable. Oh, they are off to a very important meeting. Let him pass. Or another way of saying this is that we have an easier time being compassionate to some people than we do to others, which is the point of this lesson about compassion, isn't it? The ability to be compassionate to all, to our friends and our neighbors and our enemies and ourselves and the strangers who we pass in the street, requires a bit of strength, I think. Compassion requires that we be able to put ourselves in the shoes of another person and ask how we would like to be treated if the shoe were on the other foot. There are times in all of our lives in which we feel like that butterfly, vulnerable, fragile, ultimately at the mercy of others. And there are also times when we feel like that Doberman, powerful and strong, capable of doing harm, able to snap. And the strength of compassion is having that ability to be so kind, so understanding, so tender, that the part we play reduces the amount of suffering in the world. So may it be. And amen.